While reports of rape were lower than the same period last year, they remain shamefully high, says the Minister. 9,518 people reported being raped between January and March this year.
While there has been a decline in sexual offences cases, which is 9,518 people were raped between January and March 2021. This has been a little bit of stabilization, and 387 cases were reported, amounting to a 4% decrease compared to the previous supporting period. A sample of 6,893 of the rape incidents revealed that 4,130 of such incidents took place at the home of the victim or the home of the alleged rapist, which means those people might have known to each other. The Eastern Cape Lusikisiki police station recorded the highest incidence of rape, overtaking the Inanda station, which has sadly held this #1 position for some years.
All right, let's speak now to Dr. Johan Burger from the Crime and Justice Division of the Institute for Security Studies. Good evening, Dr. Burger. So, is it possible to understand why murders are up?
Good evening, Sally. It's not an easy thing to explain any of these trends and tendencies that we see, but I think we need to take this back to the crime stats before lockdown, and there we saw at that time an increase in serious and violent crimes, including murder, for 8 consecutive years. So during lockdown, especially levels 5 and 4, as a result of all the restrictions and especially restrictions on movement and so forth, high police presence and so forth, we saw a huge reduction in these violent crimes. That includes murder. But gradually over the 4 quarters, especially the previous 3 quarters of 2020 and 2021, we, as the lockdown was eased down, restrictions were lifted gradually, we also saw the gradual return to previous high levels of crime, and that includes, again, murder. So it's difficult now to understand why murder is one of the few crimes that actually increased over the last quarter, when some of the other crimes decreased, such as aggravated robbery. But now we must look at aggravated robbery also, and we see that at least 4 of the subcategories of aggravated robbery has increased. House robberies, business robberies, carjackings, and so forth. So it's not possible at this stage here to properly explain this, apart from saying that although there was a slow return to previous high levels, we think the return in end of December to end of February this year to level 3 again impacted on some of our serious and violent crimes, and part of this is perhaps the curfew, as well as the restrictions on the sale of alcohol and places where alcohol is consumed, such as shebeens, etc. So it's a complex thing. There's no easy explanation.
I just need to clarify something. My understanding is that these stats are looking at January, February, March this year, comparing it to January, February, March last year. Now, we weren't in a lockdown January, February, March last year, except for the last week or so of March. So I still don't understand why murders are up. I understand what you say is that we're seeing a general trend of murders going up. But I suppose the reason I want to know is what's the point of having these stats if they don't give us clues as to why murders are going up?
Yeah, Sally, it's a good point, but I think what we must understand, I think I pointed out, in the 8 years preceding the lockdown, murder was going up gradually every year, consecutive rise in murder over a period of 8 years, year on year. So that was interrupted last year when the lockdown was declared. And that meant a huge decrease in our murder rate. So it's difficult then to explain the situation around murder and other serious and violent crimes when you have had this disruption in the trends. And it's not because of anything the police did or anybody else did. I think it has to do with the implications and the impact of the lockdown itself. People, movement was restricted on road, people movement, vehicle movement, high visibility of the police, the military, and a range of other.
Yeah, but we're not looking at the lockdown. I mean, these stats don't relate to the lockdown. That's why I'm not sure why the lockdown is even part of this conversation. That's why I'm confused. So explain to me.
Well, the lockdown still continues. I mean, we are in level 1, but I did say to you that in December, I think the 28th of December, we went back for a short while to level 3.
Sure.
And we had, again, more restrictions, such as, for example, the curfew.
Yes, sorry to interrupt, but I understand. But despite that, even with some restrictions still in place for the first 3 months of this year, our murders are as high as they were, in fact higher than before the lockdown. So I suppose I'm trying to get an understanding of why that's happening. But let's park that, because what I want to ask you is there anything from where these murders happen that can help guide policing decisions? I know there's talk about where the rapes are happening, and Lusikisiki is an area of concern. How are these stats used about where they're happening to change policing policy?
Well, you're trying to make something that's very complex, very simplistic in terms of its explanation and understanding. But let me return to your last question. I think what part of the criticism against the police is that they do not properly use the analysis of their own crime statistics in terms of using it to determine the hotspot areas, and even where they do determine the hotspot areas, to put in place the kind of measures that will deal with it. Now you have to look at murder as part of the so-called interpersonal crimes. There you have to make some distinction between interpersonal crimes, such as murder, attempted murder, assault, and sexual offences, and other serious violent crimes that has to do with property-related crimes, such as are linked to aggravated robbery. And so the interpersonal crimes there are, to some extent, things that police can improve on in terms of what they do. As far as, for example, focusing on the so-called hotspot areas, but to do so in terms of what is now known in police circles as evidence-based policing, and to apply certain methods and test them on a regular basis to determine to what extent do they work and where it doesn't work. And in terms of aggravated robbery, for example, you look more at the utilization of good crime intelligence, good investigations, and that's a whole different ballgame. So our belief is that there are things the police can do much, much better, but there are things where there should be much more or much better cooperation between the police service and other state institutions, NGOs, and community-based organizations.
Yeah, you're quite right, because of course there's not a lot the police can do about those interpersonal crimes, because as you say, they often happen in homes. I am very interested, just finally, to ask you about the apology we heard this week from the police minister in Parliament about their DNA labs being severely backlogged. I'm just wondering, with a problem like that, surely it is open season for our rapists.
Yes, and not just them. Many other criminals. We must keep in mind that for many crimes, the only way that criminals can be properly identified is through DNA testing. So there needs to be samples and testing. For many other crimes, the DNA is an additional part of the evidence to where criminals were already identified, but where there is not enough evidence to successfully prosecute them. So it's true then that many criminals avoid the criminal justice system simply because there's not enough evidence, and there's not enough evidence very often because there are these problems with the police's forensic institutions, the laboratories, and the ability of the police to have all of these samples properly collected and properly sampled in time. So the admission by the minister is welcome, but it's a sorry state of affair that he even have to apologize and that it took them so long to realize that they have the problem and to do something about this.
Yeah, thank you so much for highlighting crucial aspects of policing and how these stats need to be used properly. Really do appreciate your time. That was Dr. Johan Burger from the Crime and Justice Division of the Institute for Security Studies.